Well, good evening. Thank you again for coming to another seminar or lecture, part of the Center for Global Humanities series. My name is Anwar Majid. I'm the director of this center. Um, I am absolutely delighted today to introduce the topic first and then the speaker. The topic is very simple. It's a question, in the form of a question: what is happening in Yemen? I'm sure a lot of people in this room are eager to find out now that now we are witnessing some kind of domino effect in that part of the world. One nation after one regime after another is falling. Everybody's wondering about what's happening next, particularly in Yemen. We cannot find a better speaker than Daniel Varisco. Um, Daniel Martin Varisco is professor of anthropology at Hofstra University in Hampstead, New York, where he has taught since 1991. He received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1982 on 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork in a highland Yemeni village. During the 1980s, he consulted in international development in Yemen and Egypt, as well as receiving full postdoctoral grants for research on the history of Arab agriculture and folk astronomy. He has served as president of the Middle East section of the American Anthropological Association and is on the board of the American Institute for Yemeni Studies and the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq. His most recent books are Reading Orientalism, Said and the Unsaid. It sounds, just the looks of it is very interesting. A remarkable book examination of Orientalism by Edward Said, and he absolutely left no stone unturned in trying to find out the extent to which Said did or did not do justice to some of the texts he examines. And Islam Obscured, the Rhetoric of Anthropological Representation, published in 2005. He has published more than 45 articles in professional journals, as well as editing Yemen Update from 1990 to 2002. He serves as co-editor of Contemporary Islam, editor of the online journal Cyber Orient, and webshake of the academic blog Tafsir, wonderful blog which I read very regularly. He is currently working on a comprehensive history of Yemeni agriculture in the Islamic era entitled Arabia Viridis. Not only, besides this, he's an absolute man of the Renaissance, very well versed in a lot of different subjects, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome him tonight, and also his wife Najwa, who is joining us today. So thank you so much.
Well, I want to first of all thank Professor Majid for inviting me. We've been here for a couple of days now and enjoying Portland. You have a beautiful city. And we certainly enjoyed coming to the university today, and you have a very nice campus as well. I always worry about introductions, though, because, after the introduction, I'm wondering how much time do I have left after all that. But at any rate, I see we've changed to the PowerPoint. I'm a firm believer in pictures being worth many, many words. So I put together a PowerPoint to tell you what's happening in Yemen, and we will begin by looking at what's happened in Yemen. But just for those who may need a little reminder as to exactly where Yemen is, you can see on the map there in the green, it's in a very important area. You have the Red Sea on one side, you have the Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa there across the Red Sea and across the bottom of the Gulf of Aden, which is part of the Indian Ocean. There's a lot happening. If we were just to talk about Somalia and Kenya and Ethiopia and Sudan, right? We could talk about all of those because they're all in the news today. You could pick up the New York Times and be reading about them. Obviously, Libya and Tunisia are in the news, as Professor Majid pointed out. But we're going to take a look at Yemen, probably the least known country in this seeming domino effect of the Arab Spring. So there you are, just to get a sort of a sense where we are. This right here. So I thought I would begin with what happened in Yemen. and perhaps something that you're already aware of, although you may not have realized it was Yemen. On the left, of course, a passage from the biblical book of First Kings about King Solomon. King Solomon was visited by the Queen of Sheba. Well, Sheba is Saba in Arabic, and it was a kingdom that was located in the western part of the modern state of Yemen. Now, that was what is mentioned in the biblical text. So Jews and Christians know about Yemen through Sheba, but then we could go to the Quran. And in the Quran, there's a reference to the famous dam, the Marib Dam, the remnants of which are still available. This was a dam that had been constructed before the Common Era and was more or less destroyed about 300 years after the beginning of the Common Era, but it made the Quran. So, Yemen is a country that certainly these religious texts are very well aware of. And you may have heard this term at some point, Arabia Felix, a bit of a misnomer. It means happy Arabia. Hasn't been a very happy history in Arabia, certainly in recent days. But this is from a very famous map. It's actually a medieval representation of a first century Greek text, the famous Periplus, that talked about the trading network in the classical period, and mentions, as you can see, Arabia Felix and some of the towns. You can sort of get a sense here. It's not quite the same dimensions as the earlier map that I shown, but then this was before we had the modern map makers in the area. There's a further reference in the Quran to Yemen. The year that the Prophet Muhammad was born was about the year 570 in the Common Era. There was a Yemeni king. His name was Abraha. He was a Christian king at the time, and he thought he would conquer Mecca. So he came up and he had a secret weapon. It wasn't drones, but it was elephants. And he thought with these elephants that had come over from Ethiopia, they brought them over from Africa, that he could conquer Mecca. And it's recorded in the sacred history of Islam that he came to the city and the city didn't know what to do. The grandfather of Muhammad, a man by the name of Abdul Muttalib, said, we have to trust in God, and God will save us. And the story, and it's mentioned there in the Quran. In fact, there's a chapter called Surat al-Fil. Fil means elephant in Arabic. That the story is that when Abraha came with his elephants and it looked like all was lost, that God sent birds, and the birds dropped pebbles and rocks on the army of Abraha, and Abraha's army, of course, ran away, and the elephants were scared and they ran away. So even in the very beginning of Islam, you find a mention going back to the country of Yemen. Now I'm going to move fast forward here. Some of you may, I'm not going to say some of you may remember the Crusades, but there was this period of time, better be careful what I do here, there was this period of time that we call the Crusades, started by Pope Urban at the end of the 11th century. There were several of these. And of course, the most famous Muslim general, I suppose, was Saladin or Salahuddin in Arabic. And Salahuddin, who reconquered Jerusalem, established his own empire, his own dynasty, and he was called the Ayyubi, El-Ayyubi, and we know this as the Ayyubid period. And as you can see there in the green, so we're talking here almost about, we're talking about 900 some years ago. This was the Ayyubid Empire. They not only controlled the modern area that we would say is Israel and Palestine and Syria, but they controlled Egypt, parts of Sudan, the coastal region of Saudi Arabia, and the brother of Salahuddin, his name was Turan Shah, went down and conquered Yemen. And so that established a foreign dynasty along the coastal zone, as you can see down there where I have a reference to two towns. One, Zabid, and that is on the Red Sea coast in Yemen, and it was a very famous center of learning in the Islamic world. And the other was Aden. You probably know about Aden. from the attack we'll talk about in a moment on the USS Cole, the American ship, back in 2000. But at this point, you had a foreign occupation, not of the highlands, right, but of the coastal region. Now, what happened is the Ayyubids, as you can see, weren't very long in Yemen. They started in 1173, and they were basically in about 50 years, they were gone. What happened is that these people weren't from Yemen, the rulers. They were from up north, and they didn't like Yemen. And the last fellow who was a ruler there, his name was el-Masud, Malik al-Masud, he was being transferred to Damascus, and he couldn't wait to leave Yemen and go up to Damascus. And he didn't really have someone to leave in power at the time. So he had a mercenary. I mean, the Ayyubids were mercenaries, but he had his own mercenary group, another group that originally came from Central Asia. And they came to be known as the Rasulids. So he left this fellow in power. And Masud, on his way to Damascus, died. He died in Mecca. And the fellow who was temporarily in charge, shall we say, back in Yemen, decided, well, I can be a sultan as well as anyone else. And so he petitioned the caliph at the time. This was still just before the end of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. And he said to the caliph there, well, if you recognize me as the ruler here, then I'll give you tribute. And the caliph said, sure, why not? So now you had a new dynasty coming into power, the Rasulids. I'm particularly interested in them because they were patrons of the arts and the sciences. A lot of manuscripts were written, and they came into power just before, about 2 decades before, Baghdad was utterly destroyed by the Mongols. And manuscripts were lost. They had a tremendous library there. So Yemen became a center of learning. And some of these manuscripts that were made in Yemen about the sciences, about agriculture, still exist. And that's one of the things, as Professor Majid mentioned, I'm working on. Well, here's a map of Yemen. This is one that was made between the years 1300 and 1320. Interesting, isn't it? Now, it's a little hard for you probably to figure out here because it doesn't look like our normal maps. However, it is oriented towards the north, which was somewhat unusual actually in this time period. Most maps weren't. Now, what I've done here, if you look over here where it says Aden, okay, remember on that other map, Aden is on the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and it's probably one of the best natural ports in the world, because it's really a crater. And that's why, unfortunately, ships like the USS Cole of the American Navy were able to go right inside, very close to the shore. And that's what made it such a perfect port in the classical period, throughout the Islamic era, and even today, it certainly has potential of being developed. I had mentioned Zabid in that previous picture. So over on the left side of the screen would be the Red Sea. And what this is a map that was made of the Rasulid regions, the regions that they controlled. Some of them they didn't control. Their main capital was at Zabid during part of the year, and then they would go up into the mountains to, you see where I have a sign there, it says Taiz. So here we have, this is an extraordinary map. There are maps of towns as well in the same document, and it's actually a tax record document. Okay, at that time they didn't have a tea party that was against taxes, not in Yemen. And so the main revenues that the court would be obtaining would be from the customs due at the ports like Aden, and then taxing the people. And it's a record of all the taxes that were coming in. Extraordinary document, gives us tremendous data on the economic system and the political system at the time. We're going to leap forward a little bit more. By the beginning of the 16th century, Europe is beginning to interact with Yemen. You now have the Portuguese, remember Vasco da Gama, working his way around the southern coast of Africa and working his way over into this part of the world. And right on the heels of the Portuguese were the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks. In the middle of the 15th century, that was the fall of Byzantium. of the eastern part of the Roman Empire by a group, the Ottomans, who were Muslim, and who expanded their rule not only in Turkey, but into the Levant and down into even Yemen. And these are the two time periods when they had some control in Yemen. The last one, just before the First World War, of course, Turkey was on the side of Germany in the First World War, and so when they lost that war, they were removed from the area. In 1839, the British, who were in the beginning of establishing a political control of India, the famous British control of India, they needed a fueling station. Their ships now had coal, right? But if you left England and you wanted to go to India, you're going to need some fuel along the way. And so they actually conquered the port of Aden in 1839. And they didn't really control the hinterland inside, but they controlled Aden and built it up as a very major port. In the 1950s, Aden was one of the busiest ports in the world, primarily because at that point, of course, you had the Suez Canal, you had the ships coming down from the Mediterranean. It was a very, very important port at that time. And then in 1967, the British abruptly left. And in their wake, there was a People's Republic of Yemen that was formed, a socialist republic in the south. You see one of the stamps over here on the left celebrating the Independence Day. And there you see the picture of one of the last British soldiers before they pulled out of the port of Aden. Now, we're going to go back in time a little bit so we can go forward in time. What I have been talking about is the coastal region of Yemen, which is a lot easier to conquer and to control. In the central highlands of Yemen, and there are huge mountains, the highest peak goes up above 9,000 feet above sea level, and it's impenetrable. So that this area, it's a tribal area, it's a region where it was very difficult for anyone to come in and control. And there was a group in power here. They were a religious group. They were of the Shia, although they were not the same ones that you would find in Iran. They called themselves Zaydis, and they established a religious theocracy where the real power was with the tribes. There was no army here. It was called the Zaydi Imamate from, as you can see, 897, very early on, until 1962. This is the last religious ruler of Yemen. In 1962, there was a thawra, or a revolution, in what we call North Yemen, on the 26th of September. The son of the last imam, his name was Badr, was basically forced out. There was a bitter civil war. The Saudis were on the side of the Zaydis, not of the new republic. But Badr lost out. There was a reconciliation by the end of the 60s, and Badr ended up living in London. He died in 1996. The man who led the revolution was a military man who had been trained in Iraq, and his name was Abdullah Salal. His father had been a butcher, right? So here you go from having the elite being in control of the country, a theocracy, to a man coming into power, a military man, sort of coming up by the bootstraps, you might say, coming from a profession which did not have much value within the society. Basically, since then, you've had a succession of military coups and leaders. In the mid-1970s, a man by the name of Ibrahim el-Hamdi became president. I mean, basically, there was a military coup, and so he became president. When we arrived in Yemen in 1978, the president of Yemen was a fellow named Ahmed el-Ghashmi. El-Hamdi had been assassinated. El-Ghashmi was in power less than a year, and he was assassinated in a very strange sort of plot. I mentioned before that there was South Yemen and North Yemen. There were elements in the North Yemeni army that were sympathetic to South Yemen. And there were elements in South Yemen that were sympathetic. There was a lot of intrigue going on, sympathetic to the president in the north. So al-Rashmi, who was president in the north, thought he was receiving a briefcase with a list of the generals that he had which were going to go against him, right? And so when this man came from the south, he was brought right into the president's office, opened the briefcase, it was a bomb, and killed Kashmi. And to this day, we don't know, was the man who opened the briefcase, did he know it was a bomb, or had the briefcase been replaced? At any rate, at that point, and my wife and I had just arrived in Yemen a couple of months before, basically there's going to be a new leader. The man who came out on top, Ali Abdullah Saleh, started power in July 17th, 1978, and as of the last time I checked the internet, is still in power, became the leader. And you can see his picture here is a rather gaunt individual. There had been talk all along of uniting the two Yemens, bringing them together, even though one was socialist and one was a republic in the north. Finally, that was pulled off in 1990, in July of 1990. And what they did is they literally merged the two governments together. Now, North Yemen had a much larger population than the south, probably 10 times as large as the population in the south. So when they merged, they just kept everybody. So the president, and it was supposed to be rotating, but the president of the north was the first president, and the president of the south, Ali Salam al-Baid, was the vice president. And they did the same thing with ministers. So one minister, either the minister from the north or the south, was the new minister, and the other former minister was now the deputy minister. This is not a very good situation, as you might imagine, merging like that. Now, unfortunately for Yemen, because you would think this is great, the two countries are uniting, the socialist government is no longer socialist, so they're going to have aid coming in from the West. Fantastic, right? Everyone was hopeful. In August of 2000, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. The Yemenis got caught in the middle on this one because Yemen tried to broker a peace deal. They didn't want a war. They got along with Kuwait and they got along with the Iraqis. But the Saudis didn't like what the Yemenis were doing. And so Yemen was basically put on a blacklist. USAID pulled out its work in the country. Most of the Yemenis who had been working abroad and sending money back, because Yemenis would work in Saudi Arabia, they would work in Kuwait, they were forced to go home. So it was a total disaster for Yemen economically, because they lost the income coming from those Yemenis who were working abroad, and all these, perhaps as many as 700,000 men came back without any work. So the unification had a bit of a problem here at the beginning. Is the lighting bad? Could we turn the light? Did I have the wrong date up there? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had checked this one. Okay. Once in a while, you get something wrong. It's good to have your wife along. It was 1990. Did it say 2000? Oh, dear. Sorry about that. Is this too light? I mean, could we turn this light down here on this? Is that possible? Because I'm not looking at it. It's not possible. Okay. If it's not possible, it's not possible. So very quickly, why does Yemen matter to the United States? Why should we care? Now, I'm going to go through briefly. This will give you a little hint of you can sort of look at that for a moment, and then we'll go through this and see each of these. The first thing is the United States has had a long tradition of providing development aid. Both my wife Najwa and I have worked on a number of development consulting assignments in Yemen, particularly in the 1980s. In fact, and this is an interesting story, back when we had President Kennedy, he started the Food for Peace program. And one of the recipients of that was Yemen. And what they would receive would be sacks of flour. Now, we arrive in the village, right? And of course, we're trying to pick up, even though we both know Arabic, we're trying to pick up the local dialect. And they kept referring to the flour, you know, like white flour, like you would normally. They didn't use the normal Arabic word. They kept saying, Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy. So I'm trying to think, did it come from Canada? I knew it wasn't an Arabic word, right? And then someone finally said, Kennedy, you're president. And what happened is that this, John F. Kennedy was the name that was on the sack of flour. And so it became Kennedy, right? There's a long tradition of that. I mean, if you are in Yemen and you go to buy an orange, you ask for a Portugal, right? This is quite, well, and if some of you this morning had coffee, maybe you had mocha. Mocha is a port in Yemen where most coffee came from, right? So there's nothing unusual, of course, in that. At any rate, there's been a long tradition helping with education, with agriculture, with water and sanitation, with health, and it's starting up again, even though it's much more difficult, as you might imagine today. So our government has been involved in terms of helping Yemenis, of training Yemenis, of bringing Yemenis to the U.S. To get engineering degrees and other things. And then, of course, there's oil. Now, when you think of the Arabian Peninsula, you think of those oil-rich states like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Qatar and Kuwait. Well, Yemen did not have oil until 1986 was when oil first began to be produced there. And it was an American oil company, Hunt Oil. In fact, Ray Hunt, and this is a Texas-based oil company, was very, very close to Ali Abdullah Saleh. When Ali Abdullah Saleh came to the U.S., he would go visit Ray Hunt in Texas. So the Yemenis were very, very pleased that the Americans found oil. And as you can see, they also, later oil was discovered in what was at that time, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. So both parts of Yemen have oil. They don't have a lot, but as you can see here, up to 75% of the government revenue is coming from the oil, and 90% of their exports. So you want an oil-dependent state, and they are not rich at all for a number of reasons that we'll talk about. Now, when bin Laden was in the news, of course, much was made of the fact that, yes, bin Laden, he originally comes from Yemen. Right, and so somehow even though he actually comes from Saudi Arabia, there was this, bin Laden and Yemen. This connection was made. Bin Laden's father and grandfather came from the Hadramaut, which is part of the southern part of Yemen, but certainly not in the north at all. And here's a quote that he made in 1996. And I'm going to give you the quote because I'm going to unpack, if you will, a false impression that many people in our country have about Yemen being a haven for terrorists. But I wanted to start with this because here you have bin Laden saying, well, Yemen would be great. It's like Afghanistan. They have these tribes and they have these mountains and we could hide there. All right? But he never went to Yemen. And there are some very good reasons why he did not go to Yemen. But I just wanted to bring that up to set the stage, just showing some of the mountains here. What happened is that during the time in which if you fought in Afghanistan against the Soviets, you were considered a freedom fighter. That's the word that Ronald Reagan used. They were called mujahideen. And in fact, countries like Egypt and Yemen and Libya were encouraged to send fighters to fight against the Soviets. Now, a number of Yemenis went to Yemen, right, and were fighting alongside other Arabs who were joining the groups that were there. The Taliban came along rather late, but yes, there were Yemenis who were involved there. Now, after the fall of Afghanistan, most of these Arabs left and went back to their home countries. Some went back to Libya, to Egypt, wherever it was. Well, some came back to Yemen. One of them was a man by the name of Abu Ali al-Harithi. Should be al-Harithi. I forgot the I in there. He had fought with bin Laden. Comes back in 1996. He is one of the individuals that's sometimes associated with, as you can see in 2000, the attack on the USS Cole. The other individual is over here, Abdurrahim al-Nashiri. He's actually a Saudi, right? Not a Yemeni, but he is the real mastermind of the Cole bombing. He was captured in 2002. He is still in Guantanamo. All right. As you can see, Abu Ali al-Harathi was assassinated. He was killed in 2002. So the two individuals who were most closely associated with the bombing of the Cole met their fate rather quickly, actually. Now, again, there were these individuals who would come back. However, to say that there was somehow a presence of al-Qaeda as though they were taking orders from bin Laden or from any of the others, there's just no evidence for that. There were individuals who had their grievances, but most of the grievances were with the president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. But what happened in 2006, and what happened after the Cole was bombed, Yemen basically invited the FBI and the CIA in. And I mean, you can talk to our people who've written about it. The Yemenis just said, find them, okay? By 2003, pretty much all the people who were suspected of being, al-Qaeda sympathizers or had been with bin Laden had been rounded up or killed. Now, there was a major prison break in February of 2006. About 24 individuals escaped from the main prison. Obviously, they had some help. There was a tunnel went into a mosque, and they escaped. Among those were two individuals. This is a very famous video that came out in 2009 about al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Very strong anti-Western video that was just on every news station at the time. The two arrows are pointing to Qasim al-Raymi and Nasser al-Wahayshi. They were two of the individuals who had escaped that day. They had been in prison, and they escaped and became part of the leadership. The other individuals, you will note beneath them, I have a little symbol there of Guantanamo. Saeed al-Shihri and Muhammad al-Awfi had been released earlier from Guantanamo back to Saudi Arabia, and then they had fled from Saudi, and they were supposed to not engage in terrorism anymore. They had fled from Saudi Arabia to Yemen. They escaped. And so here you have four individuals who are now claiming to be al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, two having escaped from the Yemeni prison, and two having been returned to Saudi Arabia, but having, from Guantanamo. All of them are, in fact, dead today, except al-Awfi, who has he gave himself in, not long after this, to the Saudis, and has been speaking out against al-Qaeda, against these groups, saying, don't do this, don't be against the West. So this leadership doesn't exist anymore. But just to give you a little background, because there's just so much about it in the news. So in 2009, like that video showed, there was a merger between those individuals who called themselves al-Qaeda, who had fought with bin Laden or who had sympathy in Saudi Arabia, and those in Yemen. And the main reason was that Saudis were really cracking down on these people. And it was a lot easier to go into Yemen, where the Yemeni government didn't have real control over the countryside. Now, as I mentioned, it was just this year, those two individuals that were part of the original Brain Trust, al-Wahayshi and al-Shihri, had been killed. Their main aim was to topple the Saudi government. And in fact, they carried out a number of terrorist activities. They even tried to kill the Saudi counterterrorism chief in August of 2009, unsuccessfully. And they are the ones who claimed responsibility for that failed attempt of the underwear bomber, the trial of which is going on, or just went on recently, of course. But in fact, most of the damage that they have done has been in Yemen or in Saudi Arabia. There's been nothing whatsoever in the U.S. except for that, apparently, for that one failed attempt there. And of course, the name that we all know, because it was very recently that he was killed in a drone strike just a couple of weeks ago, is an American citizen by the name of Anwar al-Awlaki. Was born in New Mexico, grew up in the United States. In 2004, he went back to Yemen, to an area, Shabwa, that the government does not really have much control over. He was teaching in a religious school, a very conservative religious school. At one point, he had been put in prison, then he was let out of prison. He has been called the bin Laden of the Internet. He made Internet speeches in English. Most Yemenis had no idea who he was, right? But he was, of course, prime news in the Western media because, and he was someone that had been contacted by the Nidal, the fellow in Texas who walked into a recruiting office and killed a number of people. So his name has come up. And he said things like this, as you can read right there, which is pretty provocative. And there is a debate going on right now, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit later, of whether or not a provocation like this is sufficient to allow an American, he was an American citizen, to be killed in a drone strike. Yeah, it was September 30th. He was killed by a drone along with a couple of others, one of whom is Samir Khan, who is a Pakistani who also grew up in the United States. He actually went to the same elementary school as my son. We knew his family. But he was radicalized a little bit later on after his family had moved to, North Carolina. Somehow he ended up in Yemen, and he became, he started actually in 2010 a very glitzy magazine called Inspire, which is just, it's full of hate. It's in English. But it was an attempt to try and get recruits, obviously, by people who speak English. And this issue just came out before he was killed, referring to the Twin Towers as the greatest special operation of all time, which I think might be somewhat of a problematic. Anyway, they were killed along with another person. Now, I've been talking about this, and I want to share with you, and if you're interested, I can give you, or you can just go to West Point. There is a counter-terrorism, a combating terrorism center at West Point, our main military for the Army base. And they have recently put out a report in which they are very critical of the American policy towards Yemen and the assumption that in Yemen that it was a haven for terrorists. So I'm giving you a quote here from West Point, all right? They have someone on the ground who's been interviewing people in this area. And those of us who have worked in Yemen, including my wife Najwa, who has done a lot of work on Yemeni tribalism, and others who have lived there, just couldn't accept the fact that Yemen was a haven for terrorists. The tribes in Yemen don't like terrorism. And they have a very intricate network of tribal customary law that has a lot to do with honor. And the kinds of activities of killing innocent people, of blowing up people in mosques, of blowing up airplanes, that won't settle with the people in Yemen. And in fact, this report shows is that instead of being a haven, over and over again, tribal sheikhs have turned in individuals seeking asylum. So again, hopefully, I'm hopeful, as are several colleagues of mine, that now that a center at West Point, which I think has some, this is not some left-wing group or something, right? This is West Point. Now that they have made this point, that maybe we can change our policy and have a more effective understanding of what's going on. Very briefly, that I had mentioned the fact that the two countries had joined together in 1990. 4 years later, there was a civil war where the North basically took over the South, established absolute hegemony. Ali Salam al-Obeid was forced out of the country, and the corruption just went through the roof. The military, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president, his sons, the generals gobbled up whatever land they wanted. It was probably as corrupt as anywhere. And actually the protests in the South, many of the people saying we were better off before, because now they've lost everything. They don't have a socialist sort of framework as a safety net. Those protests started as far ago as 2009. So in the South, you have a group that is very upset at the government of Ali Abdullah Saleh, at the change in their way of life, the poverty that is now down there. And this had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. Okay, this was because of what the northern president had done. Then in the north, you had another problem. What happens is that on the northern border, you have Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is always very interested in what goes on in Yemen. And the Saudis have a very different religious persuasion, much more conservative. We'll call it Salafi. It could be called Wahhabi. And what they will do is that they will spend tons and tons of money to try and get Yemenis who are not traditionally even Sunni in the north. They're Zaidi. They're a different tradition. They're spending tons of money to convert these people and to get them to be pro-Saudi. And there was a Yemeni by the name of Muqbil ibn Hadi al-Wada'i, who was Yemeni, was trained in Saudi Arabia, and came back in and was very much in the pocket of the Saudis, very much against the traditional Zaydis in the area. And these Zaydis had no power anymore, right? There had been a Republican revolution, so they weren't in power or anything. It just happened to be the way they prayed, the way their interpretation of law went. He was not political, however. His was more of a theocratic or a doctrinal dispute. He was against some Yemeni pastimes like chewing ghat. I may talk about that in a moment. He was against music. He was critical of bin Laden, but he was very critical of the bulk of the people who lived in the northern part, the Zaydis up there. And what happened is that some of these Zaydis got rather angry, including a man by the name of Hussein Badr al-Din al-Houthi. And he formed a group called the Believing Youth as a counterpoint to this Wahhabi, this Saudi influence. Okay? Now, at one point in 2004, the government arranged to meet him. They wanted to do, because he was saying things against the government, and he was killed by the government. Now, you don't do that to a tribesman. You don't go into a tribal area, because he has a tribal connection, say, come and we want to talk to you, and then kill you. And so then it created basically an all-out war out there between the government, and the government was bringing in very conservative, even Al-Qaeda types they were supporting to fight against the Houthis up there. And, you know, there was a time when there were 150,000 that were displaced. There was a scorched earth policy, but it's a very mountainous area. So the president and his army were really unable to subdue this area. At one point, the Saudis had crossed over the border, but they didn't stay, fortunately, on that side. And then there was a ceasefire, and of course now it's a moot point because there are no army troops to go up there and do anything. Finally, the Arab Spring. Well, there are some pictures here you might recognize. Let's see, who can help me out here in terms of, who do we have? Start over there. Anyone? Students? What we got? Mubarak, okay, he's gone. What about up there? The first one to go. Ben Ali from Tunisia, okay. Very recently, Gaddafi. Okay, this is Ali Abdullah Saleh, and this is him after he was, I'll show another slide in a moment, he was almost killed in a bomb in June. And this fellow, yeah, he's still around. Al-Assad is still around. So when Professor Majid was talking about it looks like a domino effect, I mean, there certainly is a domino effect going on in that respect. In Yemen, the protests began in earnest back in actually the end of January, but in February. Hundreds of thousands of people, 10, 20, 30,000 at a time in Sana'a alone. Then there are people in Taiz. There are people in other cities throughout the country, peacefully demonstrating. During this time period, Human Rights Watch says there have been only 225 deaths, almost all of them protesters being killed by government troops. Tribes are not, you know, in the main, the tribes are staying out of this, except for one tribal group which is battling for power, the Al-Ahmar clan, with the president's son. So it's an amazing situation because Yemen is probably the most armed country in the Middle East. Everyone has a rifle, at least. A lot of people have Kalashnikovs. All right. I mean, this is the tribes maintain the peace, right? They're the civil society in the country. This is a 70% rural society. So you have all these weapons out there, and no one is shooting each other. And you have peaceful protests that have been going on since February. Although once in a while the government, you know, gets their snipers out to try and discourage people. Now, way back in January, Ali Abdullah Saleh said, Yemen is not Tunisia, right? Right after Tunisia fell. And I'll be honest, I wrote an opinion piece for CNN on their opinion page on their website. And my first reaction was, I agreed with him. I said, no, it's not Tunisia. He's not going to fall. he's going to last, right? It didn't take too long before I wrote another opinion piece saying, I think I changed my mind, right? I began to see the handwriting on the wall, if you will. What he did, it was amazing. So they're calling for him to step down. He has a term that would go until 2013. Mind you, before this, he wanted to pass through, they have a parliament, right? He wanted to pass through the parliament that you could be president for life. That really sort of angered people. And then he wanted to have his son run, and that people didn't like that either. So the minute all this happened, he said, okay, I'm going to raise the salaries of the army and government workers. I'm going to cut all the income tax in half. Sounds like a Republican debate here, doesn't it? Anyway. And he said he would not run again for president. And he called for talks with the joint meeting parties. Now, this is, you want to talk about a weak coalition? The joint meeting parties includes the main Islamic Party and the Socialist Party. They're together. Okay, that's weakness, I would say here. On June 4th, there was a bomb that went off in the personal mosque of his compound. There were about 8 or 9 people killed, one government minister, several the prime minister was injured, the deputy foreign minister was injured. Ali Abdullah Saleh that's a picture soon after, he was taken to Saudi Arabia, had burns over 40% of his body, probably had a collapsed lung. It is a miracle that he is alive, there's no question about it. And I don't know if you remember the famous, hello, I must be going, famous Groucho Marx tune as Captain Spaulding in Animal Crackers. But that's what comes to my mind, because 3 times Ali Abdullah Saleh has agreed to a truce, not a truce, but the Gulf Cooperation Council has come up with a plan where he would give power over to a vice president, he would leave, and there would be an election, and it would be a democratic election, and he would have immunity. They're offering him immunity. 3 times he said yes, and then in one time, everyone came, all the ambassadors were there, the American ambassadors were there, they're waiting for him to sign, and he wouldn't sign. Okay? So much so that, as you may be aware, I'm sure you're aware that just a few days ago when the Nobel Peace Prize was announced, that one of the recipients is a Yemeni woman, Tawakkul Karman. She has a wonderful quote here. She's been helping lead the protest in Change Square against Saleh, the peaceful protest, saying a day with Saleh is like 1,000 days, right? Because he keeps saying this. Very quickly, as I don't want to take up all your time, I know you have some questions. What are the problems facing the country? This is a very poor country. Forget about that oil wealth, because 1/3 of that goes into the president's pocket, and most of it goes into the army. Yemen if you take the percentage of GDP spent on the military, Yemen is 7th in the world. Israel's 5th. 7th. Who's going to attack Yemen? All right, so the military runs everything in the country. You have 23.5 million people. Very high fertility rate. Most of those you have a very youthful population as well. Very high infant mortality rate. Very low per capita GDP. Very, very low. As you can see, half of the population is below the poverty line. Female literacy is probably the lowest of any in the region. These are some of the problems facing the country, independent of the political problems. On top of that, the water is running out. They're using fossil water. The water table is declining everywhere. In the capital basin of Sana'a, which is the capital up in the highlands, look at that figures over there on the right. In 1956, if you wanted to dig a well, you only had to go down 20 meters. That's not too bad. As you can see now, do you want a well of 700 meters to get water? Bit of a problem, okay? So, and it's estimated that and Sana'a is the main capital city, that they will run out of water probably within the next 10 years, okay? So this is so you got poverty, you got declining water table. You have, I mentioned before, the grievances of the South. When I already went through this, they were taken over, and they're now poorer than they ever were, and they don't have the safety net of the socialist regime. And then you have the Somali refugees pouring into Yemen. There are 1.4 million, at least that many, Somalis who are no longer in Somalia. The bulk are in Kenya and Ethiopia. But as you can see, there's more, because this figure is from a year ago. There's more than 150,000 Somali refugees. They're refugees. They have nothing. They're in camps. And this year alone, since January, 20,000 more Somali refugees have come across. Yemen can't absorb that. So in addition to their own poverty, you add the refugees coming in. The pirates, I was talking to a gentleman here who had been with the Navy and dropped off a few pirates in Mombasa. But the Yemenis don't fool around. If the Yemeni Navy picks you up and you're a pirate, as you can see here, you're liable to be either hung or put in prison. Just to give you an example, that they don't fool around. And very quickly, I wanted to show the Yemen you do not see on the news. This is the valley my wife and I lived in. We fell in love with this the first time we saw it. It's a beautiful mountain valley with springs. There was spring water. And I was studying the traditional agriculture. This is what we looked like back then in 1978 and 1979. Of course, my wife every day would go down and get water from the spring. We actually had a very nice situation. We were living with a family that had an extra room, and they had water piped in from a spring. It was just gorgeous. It was cold water, but it was real water. But, the women would always kid my wife because everyone else, they had to go down to find, there was a spring, but you had to go down steps, right? And I shouldn't tell this because my wife would get upset, no doubt. But, one time, they said, oh, try it. So, she puts the water on her head, and she's going down, and she goes to look down. I'm going to get in trouble. A tremendous diversity within Yemen. If you talk about what's a typical Yemeni, I say, well, what part of Yemen? Okay, the individual in the upper left-hand corner is from the sort of the foothills, a place called Jabal Burra, which has an extraordinary, wonderful heritage that's been pretty much untouched. Those silver coins are Maria Teresa thalers. This is a coin that was originally minted in Austria and was because it was worth its weight in silver, it was what you traded with. And they still make these because people still want to use them. But they would make them into jewelry. On the coastal region to the right, you can see all the kids. On the coastal region, there's been long time contact with East Africa. And so you find very similar to you would on Somalia. The villages down there, the population would look. There's been a lot of intermarriage, so very different down there. The man down in the lower left-hand corner is a man running a store, but I think he had been in New York or a lot of Yemenis had worked in the U.S. and they all go back because they love Yemen. And then here are a couple girls in the mountain town where we were. So you find quite a variety of people. And then, of course, I talked before about the importance of the tribe or the Qabila in Yemen. And just very quickly, when we think, sometimes people, they think of tribes, they think of nomads out in the desert. They think of Lawrence of Arabia or something. Well, here, when we talk about a tribe, it's a territorial unit. You're sedentary. You lived in villages. And it hasn't changed. The same tribes that were talked about in texts from 1,000 years ago are still in the same place. Right? So it's more of a group that lives there rather than strict genealogy, people moving around. They're very rural. 70 to 75% of the population lives in small towns or villages. The sheikhs and the tribal leaders, they are skilled mediators. And we've seen that operation. My wife Naja has written about this. We've seen it over and over again. They're very skilled at mediating. The last thing you want is if you have sedentary villages, you don't want a dispute to sort of make into a war or something. You find a way to deal with it. It's private property. You have your own little slip of paper saying who owns what land here. So it's not as though they have it all in common. Very cooperative. And they have a customary law with checks and balances that is the backbone of the civil society. And they also have like an honor code. It's called Gebula. And quote from my wife here. What does it mean to be a tribesman? This is what they would tell her. Be courageous, hospitable, perceptive, fulfill your obligations, be truthful to your word, work hard, and don't ever strike a woman or a child. This is what these people believe. Okay, now it's changing, of course, with all the things they learned from us. But this is a traditional, as I can put to some of the changes here that are going on with the modernization, with the change to a monetary system as opposed to a subsistence economy. I'm not going to go into detail on this, even though I'm an anthropologist, because I know my time is getting too much here. But and this is only for the part that we lived in, just to give you a sense that traditionally there were social categories, classes. The three groups on the top were what you might call the free individuals. These were the ones that had status. There were the Sada, or the ones who could claim descent from the Prophet Muhammad. They were the religious aristocracy. They were the elite. They were the ones who were educated. But they were no better than the tribes. Tribes wouldn't say they were better. They respected them because they were knowledgeable or they were religious, but they wouldn't say they were better. Then you had the tribes who were the backbone. They were the workers. They were farmers. They were the ones who were the warriors and protected. And then you had a group, Qudha means judges literally in Arabic, but it was when tribesmen became educated and took on roles of judges and other important roles in the society. Then at the bottom, traditionally at the bottom, you had the Yemenite Jews, most of whom left to Israel in the 1950s on the so-called magic carpet. You had a group that was a servant group, people who did, Beni Khoms was the name in our area, but they were people who were barbers, who were musicians. These were low-status occupations. And then you had a group of former slaves or individuals who either acted in a servile capacity. There were no slaves at the time. And now this was changing even when we were there. It's still in people's heads, but of course you had a revolution where everyone is supposedly the same. People usually ask, what about women? It makes a difference whether you're urban or rural. Rural women have a lot more freedom. They work in the fields. They contribute. Anywhere you go where women contribute to the household, they have more power and they have more respect. All right? It's something about, you take a woman, you give her a leisure time and you put her in a city and you seclude her, then you're really taking away any power that she might have. Women were, it was a real shame to hit a woman in this society. Unfortunately, domestic abuse is now becoming common because of people going to cities, because of all the change that's going on. The traditional society is undergoing a change for the worse. And not everyone bails in this society. Some of the changes that have been going on, as I mentioned here, and also the foreign ideas about Islam coming from Saudi Arabia are far more conservative. You see a lot more women veiled today in this sort of shuttershop, this complete veil, than would have been the case when we were there. I did this for the students because they were reading a book by a friend of mine, and it talked about chewing the leaves of a plant called got, and it's a stimulant. A lot of people call it a drug. It ain't a drug. It's not a narcotic. It's a stimulant. It's really like, it's pseudoephedrine. It's amphetamine, except that you're chewing the leaves and the juice goes down, and it stimulates your central nervous system. It's like drinking a ton of coffee, but it's even more than that. And it keeps you awake, and it also really stimulates conversation. So Yemenis in the afternoon, they'll get together, they'll store these leaves. You don't really chew them, you store them in the side of your mouth there. It's just the tender leaves of this tree. And it's great for poets. It's great for musicians. They even do it during Ramadan in the evening, and they talk about religion. So it's a way of sort of getting people to talk as well. It's usually treated very badly in the American press. Oh, it's this horrible drug, and well, it's not really. And this is an example of it's generally segregated, the men and the women separate. It's in the afternoon after the work is done, and it's a social forum. It's something that you didn't used to do that much because people were poor. But then as the remittance money came in the 1970s and 80s, more people started to do this. And very quickly, what will happen in Yemen, and I mean very quickly, the oil is going to run out. Maybe in as much as 6 years. Imagine. That's 90% of their exports, 75% of their revenues, in a country that's already the poorest one. I think in the Human Development Index, it's 5th lowest in the world. I think only Sudan and a couple of others are worse off than Yemen. So not so good. Water's going to run out in some of the areas. You're not going to have it. available for certainly for agriculture, for irrigation. The population will not run out. They have a very high population fertility rate. Here's an estimate that, okay, right now there are 23 million. In 2025, they may be up to 45 million people. And they can't support the ones they have right now. It's the most populous country on the Arabian Peninsula. And I wanted to end with this, because look at that sign. What's it say? Someone read it? One of the students, can you read that sign? There's one where it's sort of, they didn't print the whole word out, but who wants to read it? One of you guys over there. One of you girls over there. Someone. Who volunteers? Yes, we have a volunteer up there. Okay. Terrorism, very good.
Yes, for safe movement. Yes, independence.
Yeah. And this has been going on since February. Now, particularly in the past week or two, there's been a lot of firing going on. What happens is that, I didn't go into this, and I'm going to end just quickly with this. There's a stalemate right now because the top general and maybe the half-brother of the president, his name is Ali Mohsen, and he thought he was going to be the next president, right? He's been with President Saleh since the beginning, right? When the protests started, he knew that Saleh was turning against him. In fact, Saleh tried to kill him. So and he was the main general. He had one of the big army units, the one that controlled Sana'a. He took that army unit and he said, I'm going to protect the protesters. So there's been a stalemate. The president's Republican Guard, which is an elite unit, and some units of the army, Ali Mohsen protecting the protesters. And so that's why the army has not been able, or the Republican Guard hasn't come in and just wiped them out the way Gaddafi might have, right? But they're fighting each other. Ali Mohsen is fighting Ali Abdallah. And then there's a fellow called El Ahmar, Sadiq El Ahmar, who's from a tribe, and one of tribal leaders, and he wants to be powerful as well. Most Yemenis are sitting back watching this, watching these three duke it out, right? And not wanting any of them, because this is what most people want. These are young people, old people. They're students who graduate and don't have any chance of a job. Okay, so what I was trying to do today was show that Yemen is not Tunisia, it's not Egypt, it's not Libya. That's sort of an obvious thing. It does have tremendous problems. Ali Abdullah Saleh will be gone, I don't know how soon, but he won't last very long, and the country will have a very long way to go. Anyway, I think I've taken much time.
Thank you so much. Anybody who wants to ask a question needs to speak in a microphone. So we'll have microphones on both sides of the room. Maybe you should start somewhere there. I'm one of the students.
Curious, with all your facts and statistics and everything, and have they ever talked about putting any money into like desalinization plants? Everybody, they must know about the water problem, and it's coming to a head, and it obviously made some money from the oil over the years, and they're squirreling it away, like you said. The politicians, the government takes a lot of it, and the army, the rest of it. But someone must have said, well, we got to put some money away for the future, and if we want to be around to take care of people. And you can live without food for a long time, but not without water. Mm-hmm. And I'm surprised that they haven't dealt with it.
Well, it's been dealt with and not dealt with, if I can be paradoxical here. When we first arrived in Yemen, they were talking about this. In the early 1980s, there was when there were still two Yemens, there was the Two Yemens Water Project of the UN, where they had offices in both, because South Yemen doesn't have a lot of water either. And the Dutch had a major hydrology project to map out exactly, because they weren't sure how much water was in Yemen. And there's been a high water commission in Yemen since the 1980s. The problem is that you have a government where no one makes any decision without the president okaying it. And it's always been a stalemate of a government. The government doesn't really control the country. Corruption is rampant. And even though everyone knows something has to be done, no one does anything. And so the problem keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And the part of it is, you mentioned desalinization. Yeah, the Gulf does it. Kuwait does it. Qatar does it. Israel is doing it. Jordan, Saudi Arabia is. Jordan, I'm on a project right now where Jordan wants to do it. It's very expensive still. And you would think they have the oil wealth. The Yemeni people don't see that oil wealth. It goes to the army and it goes to, okay, I mentioned this fellow Ali Mohsen, this main general who's been around since the beginning. His son owns the main oil company in Yemen. And I could go on, right? And this is part of the reason you talk about in Yemen, it's not 1%, it's probably 0.1 of 1% that owns what's going on. But yeah, it's a good point you're making. And people have known it, advisors have said things all along, and nothing gets done. Way in the corner.
Kind of going off of that, do you know if they have any plan for the oil running out? What are they going to do when that happens?
Well, they're hoping, they're actually having other firms and that come in to try and find either natural gas or more oil, which maybe they will. Right now, in terms of the proven oil reserves, it's not going to last more than 10 years or so. I don't know what they would do. I mean, Yemen actually is a country that could do agriculture. Now, the problem is that you need water in certain areas. But, I mean, what I studied when I was there was traditional irrigation, using either spring water or runoff from the rainfall, where you get more bang for your buck, if you will. You get more water on an area. The problem is that historically Yemen was great at doing this, but it were terraces. And you can't take a tractor over a terrace. It's mountains where they're just up and down the mountain, these small terraces. It's labor intensive. I mean, it would be great. They could grow their own food. But the problem is, remember that old of course we don't remember it, that World War I song? How are you going to keep them down on the farm? And so people don't want to go back and they want to be educated. They want to be modern. But agriculture, I think they're going to have to go back to some kind of agriculture because they could use rainfall in parts of the country very effectively.
What was the name of the general who's
Ali
supporting
Mohsen.
the protesters?
Ali Mohsen.
He's a general, and the military is getting a lot of the money. If he should become the head person there, what would happen? Do you think he would do something good for the country? Or
No,
is
not
it-
at all. He's the worst
just
butcher.
For power.
Yeah, he's worse than anybody. He engineered the attack on the South that killed all those people down there. He was in charge of the scorched earth policy in the North against the Houthis. He's
just
probably
a thug.
more hated.
He's just a thug.
He's a thug. Yeah. So, then the problem is that it's the same problem when you have a dictator, when you have a military coup. And I think that in the beginning, Ali Abdullah Saleh was not that bad. All right, there were a number, and the Yemeni people, I mean, when there was unification in 1990, there was this extraordinary civil debate in the society. Every party was represented from the right to the left. There's still a socialist party. There are various religious parties. And the Yemenis themselves are very independent. They think, okay? The problem is that the military has been in control, and you've had one military guy after another, as I showed there, in control. Certainly, I think they could have a different form of government. But whatever form, and this is true for Tunisia, it's true for Libya, and it's true for Egypt, you're not going to change the military overnight and make it like our military, right? They're
Heaven
still going to be
forbid.
calling the shots.
Heaven forbid.
Well, whatever.
By a few million drones.
Yes, well, yeah, okay. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I think we have some more.
Thank you. That was excellent. Early on, you mentioned that Aden was one of the largest ports in the world, busiest ports. What were they trading in at that time?
All the ships that are coming from India and China, right? If you're going to go up to the Suez Canal, this is a great port to stop in and do whatever you need to do. And when the British were in control, of course, all the British shipping went through there. All the British naval ships certainly would call in there, and any sort of British, but anyone could stop in there.
So it wasn't busy because of what goods were produced in Yemen.
Oh, no, not at all.
It was only busy because of where it was located.
Exactly.
As a fueling and whether it's getting on food or water or fuel later on.
Yeah, it was just a great location to stop on the way. And the British had built it up, of course, for their own fleet and also for the trading ships. So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you sometimes wonder if the British had stayed, if they had not left. It could have become the Abu Dhabi or Dubai.
Or you could look at it the other way. Where have the British ever colonized that isn't a mess now?
Well, Hong Kong, okay, Hong Kong it could have been another Hong Kong, right? But they left. Yeah. Well, where has anyone ever colonized where it's not a mess? And I suppose one could ask, including the United States. Because
Just to add to your point, it was also a busy port because the British moved their oil refineries from Iran in the mid-50s to Aden.
yes, they had some oil refineries there, yeah. But I mean, it wasn't Yemeni oil.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, and also in World War II, it was still important because of all the traffic down there, yeah, for the war.
I'm interested in your point about I study the International Monetary Fund, and I've just sort of recently started looking at the IMF in Yemen. And
dear.
I'm interested in your point about the basic total lack of understanding by Western officials in their policies towards Yemen. And, after the underwear bomber, Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, made some comment about how the U.S. and the IMF were going to give money to Yemen to help combat terrorism.
Mm.
And the way they combat terrorism is by giving money to the government
Mm-hmm.
and then telling them to cut social services and raise taxes. So I'm just wondering if you have any comment on this disconnect between this, like the way we fight terrorism and what's actually happening in Yemen.
Well, of course, the restructuralization, or whatever you want to call it, is big IMF policy. They want people to be paying more taxes and reliant less on those grants that are coming from abroad. But what we've done in terms of anti-terrorism is we've given a ton of weapons to Ali Abdullah Saleh, right? So we've built up that army very well. And, they haven't done the problem is that what do we mean by a terrorist? Because there was a group of individuals who took over the town of Zinjibar in the south, and they were called Al-Qaeda. They're an extreme group, okay, but they have nothing whatsoever to do with Al-Qaeda. They're not, okay? They're not people who fought with bin Laden. They're not even in contact with those people. Most of the resistance in the south is they hate Ali Abdullah Saleh. And some of these religious groups, religion is one of the best ways to get people to fight for a cause, right? It's a really good way. And so, that's happening down there. They don't really care about the U.S. This is not their interest. Their interest is their own problems in their country. And I think that's been a major problem, is that there have been people in our government who have assumed all along that, it's a terrorist haven, and they're going to have a haven for these people who are going to plot against us, like the underwear bomber. All right? And it's like, as I recommend people to read the West Point study, because they show over and over again that, in fact, this is not what has been happening. It was in the interest of Ali Abdullah Saleh not really to find that many of these real Al-Qaeda people, because if you actually get rid of them, then they're going to cut off the money. So he would once in a while find somebody. Or he would allow the Americans, that came out in the WikiLeaks, right? He would allow the Americans to send a drone in, and then he would say, I did it, when in fact he didn't. And so, Yeah, that's a problem. But yeah, there's been a long-standing policy. I mean, the UN has been involved there. World Bank has been involved in Yemen over the years. And they've done probably more damage than anything else in terms of, they never really understood what was going on in Yemen. Because both Najwa and I have been working in development since the early 1980s, so we've seen it all. Oh my goodness. Yes.
I'd like to go back to Aden. I
Sure.
thought I heard you say that it was a crater.
Yes.
What's the source of the crater?
Volcanic. It's a, you know, it's a very, very deep, just like Hong Kong, which makes it such a great place because, you know, it's not like your normal buildup of you know, of the shelf underneath. So you can go really close. Yeah, a lot of volcanic activity traditionally in Yemen. And it just happens to be a great natural port. And that's why it was used very early on. I mean, it was used probably in prehistoric times. I mean, as soon as anyone could get on a boat and go around. Yes, sir. I think he's got a good voice, but anyway.
Wouldn't Yemen's population be declining because of the water and poverty of the country?
Well, there still is a lot of infant mortality. I mean, that's a very good question, actually, right? Because they don't have the same kind of health that we have here. The thing is that they have a lot of children. Now, they always had a lot of children. I mean, you know, a family may have 8 or 9, 10 children. Now, say 30, 40 years ago, before there was much medicine in the country, maybe half would die. But now more people, I mean, there is health available, health services available. So you have a very high population fertility rate. You have more people surviving. That's why the population is so young. Half the population basically is under the age of 15. Wow. And that's something else to think about for this whole region. You know, sometimes we think of the Middle East when we say, oh, it's in control of these old bearded clerics, right? Throughout the entire region, including Iran, half the population is not out of high school yet. Who's going to be in charge? Young people. I mean, this is not like Europe, right? This is very different. Gentleman over there?
Yes, you mentioned that there is a substantial amount of Somali refugees, which just adds up to the whole problem with in Yemen. Who do you think should take the stand and pretty much take like control and help them out? Like, should it be the African Union? Should it be the rich neighbor, Saudi Arabia, or someone else from the internet?
The Somalis in Yemen or the Somalis in Somalia?
Somalis in Yemen.
In Yemen. Well, I mean, there are international refugee, like the UN Refugee Commission is there. The problem is that Yemen doesn't have the capacity to really absorb these people. And also, sometimes the way they come over, they just come over on a boat, so they may be shot. I mean, right? It may be difficult for them to get to somewhere where they could be given some sort of help or assistance. So it's a terrible situation for them, absolutely. I mean, but it shows how bad it is in Somalia, that you would risk going, you know, across knowing that you may be killed. It's a horrendous situation, and it's made even worse right now because if you're following the news, Kenya is now going after the group in southern Somalia, the Shabab, that they claim, and probably rightly so, came across into Kenya and captured some aid workers. I think the news this morning said that a plane from the Kenyan Air Force had bombed one of the southern Somali ports controlled by the Shabab. And they claim that a French ship had also sent a bomb into that town. So that part of the Horn of Africa is also heating up. I mean, all of the problems in Somalia it's just so unbelievably sad if you know anything about what's been going on in Somalia. It's just unbelievably sad.
Well, it does look like this is the last question. So again, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
You know.